if you would have questions as we proceed, the group is not too big, so don't hesitate to interrupt me. So I will try to talk about sales and operations planning and how we believe S&OP or sales and operations planning is a very interesting process in the sense that it can create a lot of value for companies. And I also believe it's a very interesting process because it's like the ideal domain for people in operations research and industrial engineering to be active in. I will also try to explain that as I proceed. So short introduction of myself. As Srini already introduced, I have two lives. On the one hand, I have an academic career. So I was trained as a mathematician. I did an MBA at the Vlerick Business School in Belgium. Then I did a PhD in operations research and more specifically in multi-echelon inventory optimization. And that PhD brought me to the Vlerick Business School, where I'm teaching the more quantitative courses like statistics and operations research, basically in masters and in MBA courses, primarily in Belgium and in China. And as a practitioner, I started my career in IT. I switched into supply chain consulting, which I did for a couple of years. And yeah, in 2016, I did a management buyout of a company called Solventure. And well, Solventure is basically implementing S&OP in industrial and retail companies. And so I will try to tell from both the academic expertise and from the business expertise what S&OP is about and how it can be used as a tool for companies to generate value. I've written a first book called Supply Chain Strategy and Financial Metrics. Some of the things I will talk about today come from that book. And in March, April next year, my second book should be released. It is called The Strategy-Driven Supply Chain. And that builds on the first book. And it's really meant to illustrate that supply chain is not something operational or something technical, that supply chain is actually something very strategic. And linking back to, I think, the audience of this call, if you have a somewhat analytical or mathematical interest or background, supply chain is a very interesting starting point for your career. And I will come back to that as there is an analytical side to S&OP and to supply chain. But it's also, I think, a very interesting point to start because the role of supply chain will only become more important. And as it becomes more important, basically supply chain also allows you to not just do the technical stuff, but also gradually more get involved in the strategic questions of a company. And you can check my website. If you follow me on LinkedIn, I also give regular updates on where we are with the book, on thoughts and ideas we have. So I would certainly like to continue the discussion in that way also after this webinar. After writing the books, I discovered I have a mission in life, and it's to help companies. So yeah, part of my time is academic, but in the end, I want to also make the difference by helping companies to use supply chain management to create a competitive edge. So once again, supply chain is not something technical, operational. It's really something strategic. And how do we create that competitive edge? We need to combine 4 pillars mentioned there. We need to take a look at strategy, at finance and operations. In this presentation, we will look at finance and operations, and it results in a higher ROCE, return on capital employed, and I will explain later on what ROCE means and how it, as a financial metric, relates to what supply chain is about. So that's a short introduction of myself. And before I dig into S&OP or sales and operations planning, I want to start with sharing my answer to the question on what supply chain management really is about, because I think supply chain management is probably one of the most vaguely defined concepts in the world. If I'm on a conference and it's a supply chain conference and people are VP of supply chain or supply chain director, if you really sit down with them and you ask what is part of their task and role and what is not, you would see that different supply chain managers have quite different roles. Supply chain management as a term is also, it's both claimed by logistics, because supply chain management is like an evolution of logistics, and it's also claimed by purchasing. So instead of supply management, we talk about supply chain management. So yeah, what is it actually, supply chain or supply chain management? And in my book here, the green book, Supply Chain Strategy and Financial Metrics, I've given my own definition, and I said supply chain management is really about balancing a triangle, and it's about balancing the triangle, the supply chain triangle of service, cost, and cash. And if we will do S&OP, or if we will do planning, or if we will do analytics, the main goal is to improve the balance in this triangle. That's what I want to talk about. Yeah, let's start with the cost corner of the triangle. That's relatively easy. It's all kinds of operational costs like logistics, warehousing, manufacturing, purchasing. We have a cash side of that triangle. Cash is working capital. And working capital has three components. It's inventory, because it's something I've produced and I have not yet sold it. So there is an amount of cash which goes up in the inventory. It's accounts receivable, which is the money I still need to receive from my customers. If I've sold something, but the customer pays me only 60 days later, then I need to wait for my money for 60 days. So it's again cash which I already invested because I had to produce. It went into the inventory and then I sold it, but I need to wait for my money. Those are the receivables. And I can subtract the accounts payable, because many companies only pay their suppliers within 60 days or sometimes even within 90 days. So if I look at the cash pool, well, if instead of paying my suppliers on 30 days, I would start paying my suppliers only after 60 days, it would create an extra month of cash. And out of the three components, inventory, receivables, and payables, inventory is certainly the most complex. Why? Because inventory is a very operational thing. It's a buffer against the uncertainty. It's like safety stock. It has to do with efficiency in the operations. If I produce in certain batch sizes or lot sizes, it's more economic. Maybe I have important seasonality and I need to do some pre-building of seasonal stock. So there's a lot of factors influencing inventory, which makes it one of the more complex elements in supply chain and supply chain management. And then we have service. And if you take a look at service or think of service, you really need to take a broad perspective. So on time in full delivery performance is a common KPI in supply chain, but service is much more than just on time in full delivery performance. The service also has to do with how narrow or how broad is the product portfolio of our company. That's also an aspect of service. What is our order flexibility? Can any customer order in any given quantity at any given time, or do I impose certain restrictions? That order flexibility is also an aspect of service. Or maybe as a company, I do consignment stock and vendor managed inventory. Consignment stock means the inventory which is at the side of the customer is still owned by me as a supplier, and I only invoice the customer once he has consumed the inventory. Basically, I'm pre-financing the inventory of my customer. I'm financing the inventory of my customer. That's a consignment stock. That's also an example of service. It's a financial type of service. So if these are the three corners, we can expand it. So next to operational costs, we can also look at R&D costs. Yeah. Certainly, if we make the link to strategy, yeah, a company which is focused on innovation may have higher innovation costs. And so then those R&D costs come into play, and also SG&A, sales, general, and administrative. Yeah, some companies say, okay, I want to focus on a total solution for my customer, but focusing on a total solution typically delivers more complex solutions. And if you want to deliver complex solutions, you typically need a better technically trained sales force. So here again, depending on the strategy, some costs may be more or less relevant or important. And instead of just looking at the working capital, which is the financial concept, we can also look at working capital plus the fixed assets. And working capital plus fixed assets, that's the financial term for the capital employed. And the working capital and the fixed assets, yeah, they are substitutes for each other. Yeah? If I have important seasonality, but I don't have peak capacity, I will need to pre-build inventory, right? So the alternative for pre-building inventory is making sure I have more fixed assets. Yeah? If I have sufficient capacity to just cover the peak season during the peak season, yeah, then I don't need as much inventory to level that out. So when people invest money in a company, it typically goes into the working capital, so inventory, receivables, or payables, or it goes into fixed assets, which is the plants, the warehouses, all the equipment I have bought to install in the plants and the warehouses. Those are the fixed assets. And yeah, after being like 10, 15 years in the supply chain domain, and when preparing my first book, Supply Chain Strategy and Financial Metrics, I realized that I see that companies really struggle with balancing this triangle, and I'll give some examples. So what I see companies doing is that, okay, we start sourcing in the Far East. And why do we do it? Why do we do that? We do that to lower the cost. Well, I say, well, I hope that if you start sourcing further away, it lowers the cost because of the longer lead time and sometimes a more difficult quality control. If you source further away, typically your inventory will also go up. Right? So we optimize on the cost, but to the expense of inventory. In a lot of companies, I see that marketing or sales is very eager to expand the product portfolio. And why do we want to create more products? Well, quite often because we say, well, it's an improvement of the service towards the customer. If I have more on offer, it will be perceived as improved service. It will lead to more sales, and it might be beneficial for our market share. And here again, I would often say that, okay, I really hope that if you expand the product portfolio, it improves the sales, because the risk is the following. If you introduce 20% new products, most probably your sales is not going up with 20%. Which means if I introduce 20% new products, but the sales is not going up with 20%, I'm gradually creating what they call a long tail of more slow-moving products. So maybe it's good for the service, but I'm creating a long tail of slow-moving products. So once again, it will typically be negative for my inventory position or the cash position. What else do we see? Well, some companies say, I want to improve my responsiveness. How will I do that? I can do that by building peak capacity. If I do that, it will be good for the service. But of course, I will need to invest in more capacity. And also, if I need to operate capacity at peaks, Well, operating at peaks is typically not very cost efficient. So it will also again increase costs. And the last example, this is what I also have seen. In general, many companies are under pressure to reduce their inventory. And why is that? Because well, inventory is cash. If a company works with 100 million of inventory and I can reduce to 90 million, it's basically 10 million which comes available as cash on the bank account. So that's why inventory is a very popular way, or inventory reduction is a very popular way for finance people to generate cash. We need cash for new investments, for a takeover. What do we do? Let's try to lower the inventory. And that leads to absurd situations. So I've seen supply chain people who committed to reducing inventories with 20 or 30%. And because near the end of the year, they don't see good ways to reduce the inventory. What they will do is they will reduce the inventory by lowering the safety stocks in the system. If you lower the inventory by lowering the safety stocks, the good news is the inventory will go down. But the bad news is that if you just bluntly lower the safety stock, you will negatively impact your service. And if you negatively impact your service, you get all kinds of operational firefighting costs. Yeah? And these are just a couple of examples of how I see companies really struggle with balancing this triangle of service, cost, and cash. And yeah, the question then became for me like, yeah, but how is that possible? How come that companies struggle with balancing that supply chain triangle? Well, if you look at a typical organization chart, it could look like the following. Yeah? And if you are the VP of sales and marketing in a company, and if you step into your car in the morning, your first thought will probably about, okay, what is going to be my sales? What is going to be my market share? So the commercial people in a company are typically top line or sales oriented. If you are the VP production of your company, then most probably your first thought in the morning will be about efficiency. Why? Because efficiency drives cost. Most probably it will be about efficiency and safety. And if you are the VP of procurement or purchasing, your first thought in the morning will be about your spend and optimizing your spend. How can I buy more volume for a lower cost? That will probably be purchasing. And then in many organizations, finance is like, it seems like a little bit disconnected from the rest of the organization. And they also talk a language that nobody really understands. So finance is talking about earnings per share and free cash flow or net free cash flow. But it sounds very intelligent, but many people don't really understand what finance is talking about. And if we translate this type of organization model to the triangle, this is what we typically get. So in general, in companies, salespeople are more service oriented, or they primarily pull that top side of the triangle. Operations people are in general cost oriented. So operations people in general pull the cost side of the triangle. And in many companies, that's the debate. It's like the eternal debate between sales and operations. It's like both sides pulling a rope. And in those companies, where it's the debate between sales and operations, I have seen inventories making huge swings as a result. So I see companies that finish the year with 100 million of inventory on the balance sheet. So that's the 31st of December. And the 31st of March, 3 months later, there is 135 million. So they have added 35 million, 35%. Finance says, dear people, adding 35 million in inventory, somebody needs to finance this. I don't want to go to the bank or to the shareholders to increase the inventory with 35 million. And as long as finance doesn't come in, nobody objects, because sales will say, oh, it's the beginning of the year. You can never have enough inventory, so let's produce some more. And operations will say, okay, it's the beginning of the year. Let's make sure we hit our efficiency numbers. So production is happy to produce and sales is happy to have a lot of inventory, because then they feel safe that they can sell a lot. So it's typically finance who says, yeah, we need to do this with less inventory, and we need to do it with a constantly lower inventory, because inventory is basically cash. So we don't want inventories to go up. We want inventories to go down, and we want to have them consistently going down. And as I said, inventory is a very operational thing, and in many companies, finance is not operational enough. So it's not finance who will typically manage the inventory. It will be that supply chain VP who needs to reduce the inventory. And okay, reducing inventory sounds attractive or easy, but it's actually quite difficult, because lowering inventories is really about balancing that supply chain triangle. And as I've tried to explain on the previous slides, balancing that triangle is not that straightforward, because different departments have conflicting objectives. That's what we see here. So first thing for me was, what is supply chain management really about? Supply chain management is about balancing this triangle. And when we talk about S&OP, I will also say, well, why do we do S&OP? As me as Bram, we as Solventure, we do S&OP to balance that triangle. And the reason that companies lack balance probably has to do with different departments having a different focus. And the S&OP process as such should also try to, let's say, bring those different points of view together and try to bridge any differences. When talking about a triangle, somebody once asked me a very good question, and he said, Bram, I like your story of the triangle, and I can relate to it, but he said, is this not how companies work? He said, won't there always be conflicting objectives between sales and operations? And will different departments not always talk a different language? And I said, well, Joost, that's a good question or a good remark, because obviously many companies do struggle with balancing the triangle. And I said, well, I do believe balancing the triangle is important. And to understand why it is important, I said, let's take a look at the triangle from an investor's perspective. And if I look at the triangle from an investor's perspective, I say service in the end is a driver for the top line, for the sales of the company. If you are improving your service, but you're not selling more, then either you are in a very difficult market, or maybe you are over servicing on a certain dimension. But in general, if you improve service, your sales should go up. But as an investor, I'm not just concerned with the service or the top line. I also want to see a margin. And the good news is that, okay, if I combine that service or that top line with the cost, I get to the bottom line. I get to a margin. This here says EBIT, earnings before interest and taxes. So that's one way of measuring the margin. You could also look at the EBITDA, EBITDA, or you could look at the gross margin. But in any case, I don't just want to see growth or top line. I want to see a margin. Well, if I combine the top line and the cost, I get to the bottom line. For instance, the EBIT. And even then, it's not just about the margin. And why is that? Well, if I have two companies that generate 100 million of profit, the first company requires 100 million of capital, and the second company requires 50 million of capital, then of course I'd rather do the second investment twice. as an investor, I'm not just concerned with the margin, I'm concerned with what's the margin or the EBIT you generate over the capital employed, over the capital I have invested. That is the financial definition of the return on capital employed, the ROCE. I would say it's the bang for the buck. If I give you $1, that's the buck. What do you give as a margin in return? What do you give as the bang in return? So balancing that triangle, actually there's a good reason. Balancing the triangle is about generating value for the shareholder as measured by that return on capital employed, or as measured by that bang for the buck. So that also means that if supply chain management is about balancing the triangle, well, supply chain and finance have the same objective. Supply chain and finance both have as an objective to generate or optimize value for the shareholder. And that's what can be done by balancing that supply chain triangle we talked about here. If we look at how that triangle behaves during COVID-19, I saw the following happening actually. When we had the first wave in Europe, and that was around March, April, the first wave, March, April, there were two types of movements. Some companies were at the good side of the crisis. Yeah. Those are the green ones. Food producers, medical equipment, hand sanitizers, even toilet paper. So those companies saw their sales going through the roof. Other companies were at the bad side of the crisis. Yeah. If you were in automotive, airspace, delivering to anything which is hospitality, to the construction. So those sectors collapsed. And what I saw was that, this brings unbalance in the triangle. So the green companies here, which saw their sales going through the roof, what you see is that those companies become very service driven or very sales driven. Yeah. And they would do strange things to make the sale happen. They would start flying raw materials across the world, and they would put things on a plane which normally would never get on a plane. And those companies here, the red companies, which were at the bad side of the COVID, so to speak, those companies all of a sudden become very skewed towards cost and cash. And that's what happened when we went into that initial lockdown situation. At some point in time that stabilizes, and then that triangle stabilizes. And at another point in time, you even see the inverse effect. So there is an uplift in the demand up till the situation normalizes, and then your demand might even be lower because some of that extra demand here has not necessarily been extra demand. Some of it is just hoarding by our customers. Here in Europe, in the initial wave, there was a huge sale of pasta, Italian pasta. Not all of that pasta was eaten. Some people were just hoarding pasta because they thought this was going to take 5 years to get out of the COVID crisis. Yeah? So some of that extra demand, you could say, is hoarding, is fake, and basically it will be going down afterwards. And what you see is that COVID shakes that triangle, and in general we are too late. So if this is the real demand, companies are slow to react, and that creates tension in the triangle. If at some point in time the real demand starts going down, typically as a company we are slow to react. And if we are slow to react, then we are surprised on the other side, and we get cost pressure and cash pressure. Yes? Question?
So the previous statistics was based on the global, or only based on Belgium, or what are the coverage of the previous diagram?
This one?
Yeah, this one.
This is what I have seen from within Europe, but I expect each continent has seen its own wave. Basically, during the initial phase where companies were shutting down because they had to. Well, some companies were seeing a negative impact, others would have seen a positive impact. So I really believe that, let's say, each continent will have seen this type of effect. Keep the questions coming in. So let me jump here to the one on the right. So again, if you were on the bad side of the crisis, you saw a lot of suppliers to automotive saw their demand decreasing. Why? Because the automotive plants were shutting down. Yeah, so they first shut down in China, then they shut down in Europe, and I assume also some automotive plants would have shut down at the US at some point in time. So if the demand is dropping, in general, we are still quite slow to react. And okay, if we already had that story of we need to balance the triangle because balancing the triangle is about optimizing value for the shareholder as measured by that return on capital employed. A second thing I've seen is that because of COVID, many companies and many CEOs realize that it's actually crucial as a company to be able to scale up and scale down quickly and efficiently. And that's exactly where planning process like S&OP can help. Yeah, S&OP can help to balance that triangle, but S&OP as a process can also help companies to more quickly and in a better way scale up and scale down their supply chain in line with how markets behave. Okay, so let's come to S&OP. What is S&OP and yeah, how do we use it? This is our vision here on S&OP. And you see different steps: segmentation, product management, demand, inventory, supply, and then exec S&OP. And at the center here, you see the triangle of service, cost, and cash. So when we do S&OP, it's really to balance that triangle. And a good S&OP process will also make us more agile. We will be able to more quickly react to changes in the demand. Let's start with segmentation. What I say there is that many companies use the same service target for all customers and all products. And just making that statement, you feel that cannot be the correct answer. So we say before you start with S&OP, make a good segmentation. No two customers are equal. Two customers don't have the same size, they don't have the same margin, they don't have the same loyalty, they don't have the same willingness to innovate. So you should segment customers. And when I talk about demand planning, I will discuss how to use the customer segmentation to optimize your demand planning process. Also, no two products are equal. Some products more reflect the past, others more reflect the future. Some products are very easy for you to make because it can be made on different production lines, and some products are very difficult for you to make because they can be made on only one production line. And if you need to make that product, maybe there's a long changeover time or there's a lot of off-grade material. So basically you are producing a lot of waste. So certainly also no two products are equal. And when I talk about inventory planning here, or when we talk about supply planning, let's think back on how segmentation can help to optimize the overall S&OP process. Second process step here is product management. And product management is about two things. It's about new product introductions, NPIs, and it's about end-of-life management. If you look at new product introductions, NPIs, I often say that 7 out of 10 new product introductions are overstated. And that's logical. Why? Because New products are typically conceived by product managers. And if product managers would not be a bit optimistic, they would probably not be in a good job, right? So I've never met a product manager who says, I'm going to launch a new product, it's going to be an absolute failure. And so it's quite automatic that if you launch new products, it's a bit optimistic. And we should also understand that, okay, if it's a new product, there's no history. So the uncertainty will also always be a bit bigger, right? Um, so how do we address that uncertainty? Well, from an analytical side, you can try to model it, but from a process perspective, it's just important to keep the finger to the pulse and say, okay, we are going to launch those new products the next few months. What's the latest status? Are we still on schedule to launch the product on the foreseen date, right? It's important to challenge the assumptions. Yeah? And who is the challenger here? It's often supply chain, because supply chain should moderate that S&OP process. So it's up to supply chain to challenge that product manager and say, hey, do you really believe we will be selling 200 million next year of that type of product? That type of product makes me think of that type of product. And instead of 200 million, we sold only 500,000, right? So introducing new products is important, especially if there's a lot of innovation, right? If you are a company which is driven by innovation, yeah, then half of your success depends on new products. If we know there is a lot of uncertainty, we need to address it as a separate step in the S&OP process. If 7 out of 10 is overstated, then 3 out of 10 new product introductions will also be understated. And of course, you don't want to be short of product if it's a new product, of those successful new products. So really play close to the ball to try to optimize the information there and let's say minimize the errors you make. The flip side of the coin is the end of life process. And there I say that companies are typically very good at introducing new products, but they are very bad at taking old products out. And the reason is that if you want to optimize the inventory in a company and you come in and you say, hey, I want to stop this and that product, sales will push back and sales will say, oh yeah, well, I understand that's not a profitable product, but we cannot stop it because we sell that product to customer A, right? And that's one of our best customers. So if we stop that product, we are going to lose that customer, and so on and so on. And this is where that triangle becomes interesting, right? Because we need to say, okay, dear sales, if we stop a product at the moment that it's no longer sold, then it's a non-moving product, and then it's obsolete inventory. So that then we are simply too late. So it's not just about the sales, right? It's again about the margin. So the question is, what's the margin we generate? That's the service and the cost combined. And what's the inventory we need to invest? And what you see there in the product life cycle is that what happens near the end of a product life cycle? Near the end of the product life cycle, the sales is declining. That's the end of the product life cycle. The sales is declining, and because we get competition, the margins are declining even faster. At the same time, from an operations research perspective, yeah, if something becomes more slow moving, but I still want to have the same service level, then I need to invest more inventory. So what happens near the end of the product life cycle is volumes are declining, margins are declining even faster. And because the product becomes erratic, I need to put more inventory. So I get less margin for more investment. I get less bang for more buck, but that's not what I want as an investor, right? So the link here to finance and to the triangle, for instance, in the end of life is quite crucial. Otherwise, you never come to a good optimization of the portfolio. And if you never stop products, if the portfolio only increases, yeah, it makes the whole planning much more difficult. So it's very important that you control the complexity of your portfolio. If from time to time I can cut SKUs and I keep my portfolio smaller, then each of the subsequent steps here becomes a lot easier. So that's where product management is crucial. Demand review. So any plan starts with a forecast. And I believe that's also a good point to talk about the analytics. And if you do S&OP, it's always a combination. It's about process, tools, analytics, and people. Process, yeah, you need to know how the process works. Yeah? If you do forecasting in FMCG, it will be driven by promotions. If I do forecasting in business to business, it might be driven by tenders. Yeah? So depending on the sector, yeah, it's always forecasting, but the process and the key components might look a bit different. You need to have good tools. So many companies have tried to run this with Excel files, as many have failed in running this with Excel files. Excel files can be a good start, but most companies have a complexity which is too big. So then you need to step to professional tooling. And we are the partner of Arkiva. So Arkiva is an advanced planning software. It's an American company. They are headquartered in Wilmington, Delaware. They are actually a spin out of DuPont. And okay, Arkiva is one of those professional tools that can be used to manage this process in a professional way. Um, Analytics, well, each of the steps in S&OP or in the planning process has an analytical side to it. So if we look at forecasting, yeah, there's a whole bunch of time series techniques which can be applied. So many of those advanced planning softwares have forecasting methods. And that could be simple exponential smoothing, more advanced exponential smoothing. That could be ARIMA techniques. And those analytical techniques, I often say, are like turbochargers to the process. If you have a good working engine, and what would be a good engine, and it's a good process and a good tool, if you have a good engine, the right analytics easily get 30% extra performance out of the engine. And I also believe this is where OR and industrial engineering graduates can make the difference, because I think this is where you have a lot of courses in. The same here, if we look at inventory, well, in OR, there's a lot of literature on inventory optimization techniques. Even this afternoon, I had a guest lecture in multi-echelon inventory optimization. It's an advanced analytical technique which helps you to optimize the inventories in a painless way. Multi-echelon inventory optimization is just playing around with inventory parameters. I can also reduce my inventory by redesigning my distribution network, but redesigning a distribution network has a much bigger impact than just tuning or fine-tuning the inventory parameter in the planning system. If you go to supply planning, you can use linear programming, or you can use heuristics to optimize the plan, right? And here again, if you have a good process and a good tool, yeah, that's a good starting point. But if you can apply the right analytics, you easily get 30% extra performance out of your engine. It also means that it's a matter of precision. If you plug in the turbocharger in the wrong way, the motor will explode. And believe me, I've seen a number of exploded motors in my life already. If you look at the bigger software systems like SAP, SAP used to have APO, Advanced Planning and Optimization. And in APO, there was a module called DP, Demand Planning. Yeah, so SAP basically has a module in APO which supports demand planning, or DP. APO DP has statistical forecasting. But the problem is, not a lot of people in the world understands how it really works. And it is typically implemented in the following way. It's like, okay, 2 days before the go live, somebody says, oh yes, we still need to configure the statistical forecasting. So somebody without the proper knowledge quickly configures the statistical forecasting. As a result, 2 months down the road, the statistical forecasting starts doing strange things. So people turn it off, which is a pity, because if I don't have statistical forecasting, the whole forecasting process becomes manual. And then imagine that you are a salesperson, you maybe have 20 clients, and each of those clients is buying 10 products. So 20 clients, each buying 10 products, that's 200 product customer combinations. If you then ask me to make a forecast for the next 10 months, 200 customer product combinations for the next 10 months, that's 2000 combinations. And no salesperson is going to do a good job, right? And that's not required, because if I analyze those 200 customer product combinations, most probably half or even 3/4 can perfectly be statistically forecasted. And the ones that cannot be statistically forecasted, those are the ones I need to ask the salespeople, okay, watch out, watch out, watch out. These are the ones you need to check, because something strange happened last month and we don't necessarily understand why. So instead of doing everything manually, if you apply the right analytics, people can start working more on an exception basis. And that is true for forecasting. It's equally true for inventory or for supply planning. So that's where analytics can really make the difference. If I continue here with forecasting, I said, okay, I want to link it to segmentation. And how do I do that? Well, okay, I say if I've done a good customer segmentation, once I really know who the A customers are, let's stop guessing what these A customers will buy from me. Instead of guessing what these A customers will buy from me, I will go out, reach out, and ask my A customers what they think to buy from me. So if I look at forecasting, I can generate a statistical forecast based on the history. But for the A customers, from a process perspective, I want to have a monthly collaborative meeting where I say, dear A customer, I've analyzed your history. Based on the history, this is what I think that you will be buying from me for the next few months. Is this also what you are thinking? Yeah. Are you aware of any big changes? Maybe you want to do some extra promotions, or maybe you have a major plant shut down, which means that you will be buying less. But for the A customers, I really want to reach out to the customer and have a collaborative demand planning process. Then I have my B customers. They are still quite important from a volume or a margin perspective, but it's typically already a much bigger group. So maybe for the B customers, I say, well, dear sales, you don't need to reach out to each of these customers individually because they are simply too many. But for the B customers, because they are still important, if you have some information, I still want you to add it to the forecast, right? And then we always have a long tail of C customers. And for the long tail of C customers, we don't want to bother the salespeople, right? It's for that long tail of C customers that, if really required, we are willing to take a service risk, right? And that's where we maximally try to rely on the statistical forecasting. So this is how that segmentation, for instance, for demand planning, can really also provide some guidance on where to rely for 100% on the statistics and where we want the statistics to be the input towards a collaborative process with the A customers. So we talked about segmentation, product portfolio management or product lifecycle management, demand planning. Each plan starts with a forecast. Then I need to think about my inventory targets. Here again, you can use analytics. And here maybe the product segmentation can be important. Yeah. Most probably, I don't want to invest my money or cash in products that reflect the past and which are difficult for me to make, right? I'm never going to win the game there. So if I invest in inventory, I most probably want to do it for strategic products, right? And I want to, typically it's more easy for me to score service on those products which are more easy for me to make. So when you think about inventory, think about your product classification, and typically the product classification should allow a service level differentiation as you start calculating safety stocks and so on, right? The demand and the inventory targets are the input for the supply planning, right? So maybe my forecast is 100, my inventory target is 20. If I have only 10 left, then my net requirement will become 110, right? 100 for the forecast. The target inventory is 20. I have only 10, so I need to increase with 10, is plus 10. So the inventory and the forecast become the net requirement for the supply planning. When we take a look at supply planning, yeah, there's different layers in planning. So there is typically what is called a rough cut capacity plan. Rough cut planning is typically in monthly periods or monthly buckets. And in a monthly plan, I'm typically looking 3 to 18 months ahead. Yeah. I try to look ahead at least a full season, right? If I have important seasonality and I need to start pre-building inventories, yeah, that's something I typically do in my RCCP or my rough cut capacity planning process. Yeah. It's capacity planning, so it also means, yeah, that I need to see, okay, if some capacities are gradually getting full, I will need to invest in new assets. Yeah. And yeah, the lead time can depend a little bit. If it's a new packaging line, maybe the lead time to install a new packaging line is 12 months. If it's a more complex production line, maybe the lead time to install something could be 24 months, or it could even be 3 years. Well, somebody will need to make sure that we look far enough ahead to make sure that if capacities are getting full, we order extra capacity in time. That's really the longer term planning process, which is often referred to as the RCCP process. S&OP as a process, yeah, is that more tactical process. So the S&OP, if you would take a look at Oliver White, or if you would take a look at Thomas Wallace, which are well-known authors there, yeah, that's typically the monthly planning process, which looks 3 to 18 months ahead. If I can look 3 to 18 months ahead, it typically also links easily to the budgeting process, because many companies now, September, October, November, are making their budgets for next year. Well, if I have a good S&OP process, which already looks 12 to 18 months ahead, it's already a good start for my budgeting process. So that's where S&OP really comes from. But if you look at supply planning, it also goes in more detail. So we have the master production schedule, or MPS, yeah, which instead of on a monthly basis is often on a weekly basis. And you can even go to detailed production scheduling. And detailed production scheduling, yeah, might just look at the next few days. And detailed production scheduling might more be like, okay, I have 3 or 4 steps in my production, which either can go in parallel or either need to go sequential. So how do I make sure that based on the incoming customer orders, each of those steps are planned in detail? S&OP is the more tactical process. If I look 3 to 18 months ahead, it's almost always based on a forecast. There's little sectors which have customer orders 3 to 18 months ahead. And we try to bring decision making to the executive team. Yeah? And that has been a struggle for S&OP over the last 20 years. How do we get the senior management involved? And there is a couple of things here on that inner circle: volume and value, aggregation, disaggregation, and scenario management. And well, let's maybe start with scenario management. if the forecast is 100, there's only one certainty. That is, we will not sell 100. Yeah, we will maybe sell 110, or we will maybe sell only 90, right? And that's it. What scenario management is about. It's about understanding that, yeah, the forecast has an uncertainty, and I can ask myself the question: what if I would sell more? Uh, how long can I survive with the existing inventories? Of if I would sell more, which production plants would probably be full and would become the bottleneck? Or what if I would sell less? If I would sell less and I just keep producing, what will that do to my inventory? And how does the inventory increase result in a consumption of cash? Or if I sell less, yeah, what are the production plans that I would try to reduce the number of shifts or reduce the capacity? So if you want to get senior management involved, try to run scenarios. That helps in improved decision making. Companies who have a good S&OP process have used this for the COVID crisis, because also in COVID, nobody has the crystal ball, so nobody really knows how long this will take, and if we will be affected by a second wave, and what would be the impact of the second wave. But if you can run scenarios, you are better prepared. So companies who had a better S&OP process typically have been better prepared, and as a result have made better decisions. If you want to get senior management involved, you need to talk dollars, right? So you need to have an easy translation from volume to value. And these things here are where you really need good tools for, right? So if you want to run scenarios in Excel, yeah, maybe it will still be manageable. But if you then also need to be able to translate volumes and values easily into each other, it won't work. So that's what you need a decent tool for. And planning in the end is about volumes. It's about, I want to produce 200 tons and it will be filled in this way and then shipped to that customer. But if you want to engage senior management, you will need to talk dollars. So you need to be able to convert the two easily. And it's also about aggregation, disaggregation, because if I want to involve senior management, yeah, they want, I need to be able to report the aggregated impact. Like, okay, if the demand would be 110 instead of 100, I don't know, this is the turnover that would be at risk, because we would deplete those inventories, and then maybe next quarter we could run into those type of troubles. But I want to report it on an aggregated level. Whereas in planning, the devil is in the details. I always need to produce a specific SKU on a specific production line and then ship it to a specific customer. But those are not the details we want to use when we report to the executive management. And so for if you are studying operations research and industrial engineering, once again, I hope this summarizes why I believe S&OP is a very interesting domain for you to get a job, because first of all, S&OP is at the crossroads. So you look into the kitchen of innovation and product management and marketing. You look into the kitchen of sales through the forecasting. You look into the kitchen of production through supply planning. You feel the pressure from finance because finance wants to have lower inventory. So you will report on inventories towards finance. And it's also a quite tactical process, S&OP. So you are reporting on what you are doing. You are reporting that into relatively senior management of global organizations. And there is an analytical side to it. And it's something that, as a master in OR or industrial engineering, it's something you master. So also when we hire, we often hire people with that degree, and they come in from the analytics side. They typically build a lot of process experience, and it's a good combination of the hard skills and the soft skills, let us say, to make a good combination there. If there are questions, Srini, if you can stop me. Good. S&OP systems. So this is what I talked about Archiva. And there is a company called Gartner, and Gartner typically publishes what they call the Magic Quadrant. And the Magic Quadrant lists different software solutions. So if you are attracted by advanced planning or S&OP, don't hesitate to drop me an email. We work very internationally. I also know that Archiva is looking for good, talented people. So Archiva is one of the software systems here in the leader quadrant. And just to say that these are different software systems. It's not 100. It's like 20 systems which Gartner has reviewed as being, let's say, high quality systems in that S&OP domain. And there's certainly not 20 in the leader quadrant. So if this would be of interest to you, feel free to reach out to me. I can also pass on your contact to Archiva. They are in the US, and we are certainly always looking for talented people. And this is what these software systems do. So typically they sit on top of an ERP system. So the ERP system could be SAP, it could be Oracle, it could be Infor. More and more, certainly smaller companies use Microsoft, like Dynamics 365. And the ERP system is managing all the operational processes, like the order management. If you call to a company and they make a sales order, well, a sales order is typically registered in the ERP system. But an advanced planning system is typically sitting on top of the ERP system. The APS, or advanced planning system, will get a lot of data out of the ERP into the planning system. For instance, if we want to make a forecast, we need to know the order history or the shipment history, where we will pull the shipment history out of the ERP. We will do some cleaning, make a forecast, and then we can put the result back into the ERP. So the forecast, which is made in the advanced planning system, could then be loaded back into the ERP system. Yeah, and it also depends a bit on what is the functionality that you are using in the APS system versus what are you doing in the ERP system. If you look at the MRP functionality, MRP, material requirements planning, is relatively straightforward. It says, okay, if you want to make a cake and you need eggs and flour and sugar, that's the bill of material. And based on the requirements for the cake, I will get requirements of the raw materials. MRP could be done in the ERP system, but the MRP can also be done in the advanced planning system. I often say, if your planning problem is very simple, do it in the ERP. If your planning problem is real life, don't try to do it in the ERP, then do it in the advanced planning system. What are examples? Well, we are working for a pharmaceutical company, and they say, well, sometimes we have a constraint of the active component. The active component is the API. That's really the curing thing in the medicine. That's something that we source from the outside, and that can really be an important constraint. Well, if you have constraints on raw materials, some companies have shifting bottlenecks. They say, okay, yeah, but sometimes the upstream operation is the bottleneck. Sometimes the packaging is the bottleneck. It depends on the mix. Yeah, that's not obvious. Yeah, if it's not obvious, it can typically not be sold in the ERP system, but that's typically where advanced planning systems are built for, right? We have PhDs, which are building LP, linear programming, optimization models, which basically solve this type of planning problems. It's about defining, okay, what are the possible constraints? What are the objectives? I want to minimize the cost. I want not to have service issues. So I will put a certain penalty on service issues. And that's how we construct optimization models. In our case, in the APH, which is called Archiva, to model real life demand supply balancing. And why do we model that demand supply balancing? Well, in the end, it's about better decision making in that supply chain triangle. That's what we really believe in. So those were the systems. Something else, this is a bit more consulting oriented. Implementing S&OP, it sounds easy, but it's not. I think S&OP is the most failed process around. And if you would Google it a little bit, you would see why is S&OP so hard? 7 reasons why S&OP fail. Why is implementation so tough? 7 mistakes. 10 common S&OP pitfalls. 5 tough nuts to crack. So it sounds very easy and logical and attractive, but in practice, it seems to be less obvious and easy. And I took out one paper here from a lady which is called Laura Ceciri. And Laura is the founder of Supply Chain Insights. And it's not academic research, it's much more qualitative. But if you would be interested in the topic, she has a lot of free research, which is more on, okay, how are companies dealing with this type of topics and why do they struggle? And in her paper, 5 nuts, 5 tough nuts to crack, she says, okay, there's a lack of understanding in the executive team. So it's difficult to bring senior management on board because they don't necessarily understand what S&OP is about. That's why I use that triangle. Everybody understands that triangle. You shouldn't talk to the executive management about complex optimization problems. Tell them about a triangle. That's something they will understand. And once they understand, they will trust you. You will build the optimization model to solve the triangle. That's okay. The right data. So it sounds easy, but if you look at like some of our bigger customers, they have like 300 sales managers which go into the forecasting every month. 300 sales managers. If you count how many customers that is in how many products, it becomes more complex. Bigger companies can have like 50 production sites worldwide. Each of those production sites maybe has 10 production lines, and not all of these production lines can produce the same products. And if you want to feed this in planning models, the data is crucial. The data is really like garbage in, garbage out. Every company I meet, they tell me, yeah, but our data is good. And each company I meet, I say, the odds are against you, right? Every company who told me that their data is good turned out that their data was crap. So getting to accurate data, which is reliable enough to trust the outcome of planning models, I think it's a practical problem, but it is a problem we encounter when we go in real life. Yeah, silos. So what I said in the beginning, the fact that different departments have different objectives and are at a different corner of the triangle, that's also something you need to overcome. Skilled resources. Yeah, and then I would add at least 2. Yeah, you need a good software to support a complex planning process, but some companies also just think that if they buy a software, it will automatically do the trick, but that's not true either. It's really about the combination of the different pillars. Yeah? And unfortunately, some of our customers also have tried to misuse the implementation of a software to make sure that everybody in the world is working in the same way and according to the same process. And that's also not very helpful for the adoption, because maybe in the US there's good reason to work a little bit different compared to Europe, because the market is structurally different, right? And if the IT department then tries to squeeze everybody to work into the same process by enforcing them to use a new tool, if the tool is not fit for purpose and is not supporting the process, people will not use the tool. And then people do invest a lot of money in S&OP in a way that it's not successful, but okay, it's because we implemented in the wrong way. And I don't want to go in too much detail here, but if that would be of interest to you, I've written a vision paper, yeah, and I think it's like a 4 or 5 pager. And in that vision paper, I've tried to summarize really my experience over the last 15 years. So if you want to change companies to adopt S&OP, yeah, how do you really combine the people and the process and the different aspects? Yeah? And it really starts with creating awareness. I had people in webinars or seminars, and they said to me, "Yeah, Bram, I want to do S&OP, but I can't convince my management." So I ask, "Okay, do you have service issues?" No, 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 service is fine. What about cost? Oh, what cost is under control. And what about inventories? Oh, yeah, but we are a family-owned business. Inventory is not a problem. They say, okay, but if you don't have problems, then maybe you don't need S&OP, right? So S&OP is not a goal in itself. S&OP is only a means to an end. And that's why if I do S&OP, I typically start with the triangle, and I draw a triangle and I ask to the company, okay, what is our struggle in the triangle? And some companies more have service issues, and some companies more have cost issues and want to improve margins, and still others want to reduce inventories and have too much aging inventories or inventory write-offs. But you really need to start by defining the problem. And the good thing is that if you define the problem, it's accessible to everybody. Sales will have and see the same problem, and finance will most probably also see the same problem. So it helps in bridging the gaps and building bridges towards the different departments, because once everybody has the same understanding of the problem, that's when you can start building towards the solution, right? And maybe S&OP can then be part of the solution. So start with creating awareness, then define the ambition. So I've shown the different steps in the S&OP process. Rome wasn't built in one day. So if people say, I want to do S&OP, yeah, I think it's never a project. It's always more a journey. So maybe you want to start with forecasting, or maybe you want to start with optimizing inventory parameters, because optimizing inventory parameters can help me to reduce inventories, yeah, which will get support from finance. Finance likes that. So if you have the full process, you need to build a roadmap and say, okay, where am I today? Where do I want to be in 5 years' time? And what seems like a logical sequence of events for me as a company, right? Uh, how will that be supported? What can I do in my ERP system? For what do I need specialized software? Yeah? And yes, of course, that will cost a lot of money, right? Implementing S&OP can cost anything between 2 million and 10 million in a mid-sized company. So that's a lot of money, but there's also a huge payback. Why? Well, remember that S&OP is balancing that triangle. So through S&OP, I'm directly impacting the customer service. So I'm directly impacting the top line. I'm directly impacting costs, and I'm directly impacting inventories and how well I can utilize my production plants. So there can be an important cost, but it also has a very important impact. And okay, you know what? Um, that's how it goes, right? And it's important that we think through what we believe is a realistic impact, and that we also, once we have implemented, because that's what we something forget, so that's what sometimes is forgotten. Once you have implemented, you need to keep and do value and benefit tracking and monitoring. But I really believe that S&OP is one of the biggest opportunities for companies to generate value and improve value for the company, because exactly you touch the heart of that triangle. So build a business case basically by looking at, okay, what could be the potential gains, what would be the potential costs, how do these balance, and then gradually you need to define the processes, or design the processes, design the tools, get that implemented, get people trained to then really start tracking the benefits. And it doesn't stop when the tool gets live. No, that's when it really starts. When you have implemented a new tool, that's when the new process needs to really get live, and that's where the value generation needs to start. So once you go live, that's where you need to start tracking the value and the benefits, and that's also where you need to start doing continuous improvement. If you come into a company and they have never used statistical forecasting before, I often say it's like getting your driver's license. Yeah? So here in Europe, to get your driver's license, you need to do a theoretical course. You need to have at least 12 hours of practice. Yeah? And then you need to do a practical exam. But if you have finished the training and the examination, you don't know how to drive a car. Eh? It's the same with the new software. Eh? It's not because here you have gotten a certain training, yeah, that you know how to master that new tool. Eh? No, companies really need to build experience on how to optimize statistical forecasting, on how to use optimization techniques to optimize the plan. So it's continuous improvement and then come to a sustain. And then the last topic I had was, and taking a bit more time than initially foreseen, Srini, I hope that's okay. It's what is beyond S&OP. So Gartner uses the terminology of sales and operations execution for the planning which is in the more operational horizon. And operational horizon is here like 3 to 12 weeks out. So the master production schedule, MRP, or the detailed production planning, that's typically in the S&OE. We talked about S&OP, yeah, which is a more tactical layer. Then also there's a lot of talking about IBP, integrated business planning. And one of the difference between S&OP and IBP is linking to finance. Yeah, but what is linking to finance? Well, in a lot of companies, IBP means, well, instead of having a plan just in volumes, we also have a plan in dollars, right? But that's not the full financial planning, because in a lot of companies, even with IBP, finance still has its own tools, and finance is still doing its own financial planning and analysis. It's called the FP&A process. Yeah? And so what we expect as a convergence is that, yeah, we will see further integration of planning processes. Yeah, from operational to include financial, but even into strategic planning. So that's also where I'm working on. So the book, which I think was here, that strategy-driven supply chain book, looks at the further integration, not just, you could say, between operational and the tactical planning or the financial planning, but also even to include the strategic planning. That's where my latest work is on. And this is what I had foreseen for this presentation.